Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to those of you who attended our first session yesterday. Hope you found it useful. So welcome to the second webinar of our Cybersecurity Awareness Month series, this time with Attivo Networks. We'll be joined by both Mark Howell and Nick Palmer of Attivo Networks and Matt Hawkins from Switchshop. Today we'll be focusing on cyber deception, and we'll guide you through recent literature and research explaining how cyber deception provides high-fidelity alerts of adversary activity, prevents ransomware from promulgation, defends Active Directory, and allows customers to respond immediately using solutions already invested in. Before we get started with the webinar, I'd just like to take you through some brief housekeeping rules. To the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the chat tab. This is public. If you have any issues with sound or want to communicate with peers on the event, please write in here. Then next to it, you will see the questions tab, which is private. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we will have time at the end for a Q&A session. Now I'll hand you over to Mark Howell at Attivo Networks.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's hope this session is a little bit more successful than my one yesterday. For those of you that were there, I managed to get stuck on a picture of a horse, and then my connection went down. So those of you that can speak, could you just let me know that you can see my first slide? It should say cyber deception, high fidelity.
Yep, got it.
All good, Mark.
Fantastic. Right, we're off and running. Okay, so good afternoon. My name's Mark Howell. I run Attivo Networks here in Europe from a commercial perspective. Got quite a lot of history with Switchshop. Delighted to be working with them on this webinar series. Always enjoyed working with them as a partner. And we're delighted to have them in our fold. So let me just tell you a brief bit about Attivo. We're based in Fremont, California. We're right opposite Tesla. We're a couple of hundred employees around the world. We've got offices in North and South America, Europe, Dubai, Frankfurt, London, Dubai, India, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. So we've got worldwide operations. And we've got a really, really clever methodology for threat detection and supporting you with very fast incident response by integrating with technologies that you will already have. More recently, as we've seen more and more cyber attacks involve the enumeration of Active Directory, we've developed a couple of functionalities and part of the portfolio to protect Active Directory and also audit Active Directory as well. So Nick will come on to that a little bit later. We have about 400 customers around the world. If you go onto the web and look us up, you will not find lots of case studies. In fact, I think you'll find two. There's a very, very good reason for that. We're designed to be under the radar. We don't want, cyber attackers, adversaries are pretty clever. They will research your organization. They will research what technologies you've got listed on your LinkedIn profile. They will look for case studies on the web, and they will find out what technologies you have in your network. And we actually think it's a very bad idea for us to be telling the world where we're deployed, because the first thing an adversary is going to do is research us, try and get around us, etc. So we play very much under the radar, and you'll understand why as I carry on. So this is where I got to yesterday. What is this? Well, this is the Trojan Horse. And really what I'm going to be talking to you today about is thinking a little bit differently about how you defend your organization from either malicious insiders or adversaries. And if we think back to this, the Greeks just could not get into the walls of Troy. They're batting on the walls, trying to get through the front door, couldn't do it. So they played a trick on the Trojans. They pretended to sail away. They left this lovely horse outside the city. The Trojans thought it was a present. They pulled in the horse, and overnight the Greeks came out of the horse and slayed the city. So the Greeks played a fantastic trick or deception on the Trojans, and it changed completely the course of that battle or that war. Now, in the physical world, deception is used all the time to gain an advantage on an opponent, whether you are defending or attacking. And there are numerous examples in warfare, in politics, in geopolitics, in sport, where deception is used highly effectively, defending and attacking. But if we now sort of take that physical world thinking and put it into cyber, deception is used by adversaries. So a spear phishing email is no different to what I've just described to you around the tactics of the Greeks putting the horse into the city of Troy. A spear phishing email is specifically designed to get through the walls of an organization. The user that receives the email is deceived, clicks on something, and the attacker adversary now has a point of presence inside the walls of your organization from which to launch their campaign, move laterally. So it is used by adversaries on us, and we are simply saying, and when we were founded in 2011, this was the idea, you have to create a more active defense, and deception is a way, a methodology by which you can create very effective threat detection inside your network. So this is not something new, right? You know, we have 400 customers around the world, and many analysts, many thought leaders are talking about it. So many of you on the call will have heard of Gartner. Last year in May, Gartner ran a tech growth and innovation virtual conference, as is the way most recently, and deception for threat defense was described as a 0 to 12 month initiative for organizations. Some of you, many of you may have heard of NIST. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies based in the US. And they've written, actually, I'm not going to share all of them, but they've written 3 papers in which deception as a threat defense mechanism is highly recommended. And they wrote a paper called Developing Cyber Resilient Systems. That was NIST 800-160, and it's freely available on the web. One of the 14 key pillars of building a resilient organization to cyber attacks, one of the 14 key pillars is deception. And they talked about obfuscation, disinformation, misdirection, tainting, how changing things inside your organization using those techniques of obfuscation, disinformation, etc., leads an adversary to waste effort, reveals their TTPs, because of every touch on something deceptive we can see what they're doing, and this unpredictability causes them problems. Now, Mitre, you will have probably all heard of, very famous for their Mitre attack framework. But interestingly, about 18 months ago, they wrote a paper called The Cyberspace Advantage, inviting them in. And it was a paper written about the value of cyber deception. And they coined this term digital pocket litter. Okay, so let me explain in really simple terms why we do what we do and what we do. And Nick, in the next presentation, will get into more technical detail of what the architecture looks like. And please do ask plenty of questions as we go through. But Mitre came up with this term, digital pocket litter. And the problem that we are solving is, the problem today is you as an organization, I'm sure, have built fantastic walls around things, perimeter security, but attackers, adversaries are still getting in. Okay, front doors get left open, windows get left open, humans configure things, things go wrong, and you're never going to close all those doors. Okay, adversaries will get in, malicious insiders can do bad things, and at that point in time, they're inside the walls of your organization. And the problem is, when the malicious insider, when the adversary moves laterally, everything they find inside is real. Okay, real networked infusion pumps, real Swift environments, real university databases, research and development. You know, universities are by design quite open. It doesn't matter what it is you're trying to protect or what's inside your organization. It will all be real, and it will all be attractive to an attacker who will want to deploy ransomware, exfiltrate it for personal gain, exfiltrate R&D, you know, for secrets, designing new drugs, whatever it is. Everything's real. And really, very simply, what we do is we put down bait on endpoints that will attract attackers to collect it. Inside the network, we put down fake assets, fake documents, fake workstations, fake servers, fake R&D, fake OT, fake SCADA, fake hospital equipment that looks, smells, feels, touches identical to the real assets of the organization, such that an adversary or malicious insider cannot tell real from fake. And we put this deceptive fabric away from the operations of a normal, good employee. Therefore, no one should ever talk to our solution. By design, we're quiet, which has knock-on positive gains for SOC analysts, because if something is touched, by design, that is a high fidelity alert. Nobody should be near it. We are silent until touched. That is a high fidelity alert. And one of the big problems that we see in universities, public sector, council is you're a small team. You've built all this security solutions. It's providing tons and tons and tons of logs. Where's the problem? I don't know. Okay, well, this is the needle in the haystack, and we only alert when there's a problem. Okay, so really simple, easy to deploy at scale. We can deploy what's called our bot sync. We can learn your environment, learn what's on there, deploy deception accordingly, and you're up and running. And we've got some very special technology to help you defend Active Directory, but also help you audit Active Directory as well. And Nick will cover that. So this is the last slide I wanted to cover. Many of you will know about Mitre, and they're very famous for their attack framework, which is a list of techniques and tactics that APTs, nation states, use to infiltrate organizations electronically or in a cyber way. Very famous for that attack framework. In the last year, Mitre have come up with something called Mitre Engage. Mitre Engage is a list of techniques, active defense techniques and tactics that are specifically designed to defend against the Mitre attack techniques and tactics. So the fact that Mitre are now famous for their attack framework, coming out with a framework of active defense techniques and tactics is amazing for the cyber deception market. And everything in orange here we map to, and you can read the tactics and techniques on the screen. Everything in white we don't. So we very closely map to Mitre Engage. So this was fantastic for us and the cyber deception market. We've been talking about deploying deception, deploying active defense for years, since we put a product on the market, which was in 2015, and now that's been endorsed by Gartner, Mitre, NIST, all three of them. And I think this has been the most important thing for active defense and cyber deception, is the Mitre Engage matrix. So look, that's it from me. I hope that was useful, interesting background. I'm going to hand over to Nick to show you how we do what we do. Hopefully I've managed to stop sharing, but are there any questions, Amy, that you can see, or anything in the chat that I've missed while I've been looking at my screen?
No questions yet, Mark.
Okay, must have been really clear. Anyway, I hope that was useful. I'll hand over to Nick. Any questions, make them really hard for him, okay? Thank you.
Before you go, Mark, can you see my screen and can you hear me okay?
I'm probably not the best person to ask. But,
yeah, I can see your screen, Nick. And
great.
You.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for the intro, Mark. So what I wanted to do today really was to go into a little bit more detail about why we do what we do and how we do it. And so in order to open that dialogue with our prospective customers, we normally start with this slide, this visualization. Now, I've been presenting these numbers for probably 4 or 5 years now, and it's not all bad news. You know, the dwell time, this is the amount of time an attacker has on a network undetected, has come down. It used to be typically 400 or 500 days, and now it's down to about 40 days. Now, I think that these numbers are being somewhat skewed by things like ransomware. You know, if you have ransomware on your network, you don't have to find it. It tells you it's there. And I think that that's somewhat changing the averages of dwell time here. I think the real figure is probably 60 or 70 days of uninterrupted time on the network for a stealthy attacker. But that then focuses the mind on what the attacker can achieve in that time. If you look at the ability of an attacker to move laterally, so from his initial point of compromise, his first priority is going to get off there and to establish persistence out to remote command and control, or to remote properties where he can store the loot and where he can do his activities from. And so once the attacker has moved laterally from that initial point of ingress, his focus then becomes crown jewel targets, where to go next, what's going to be of interest. And overwhelmingly, Active Directory is one of those targets. So if you imagine an attacker able to achieve persistence with admin permissions on a network, then whether the dwell time is 40 days, 60, 70, or 400 days, this is a long time for an attacker to be poking around on a network with privileged credentials. And the general consensus is that the longer he's there, the more damage he can do. So it's with this in mind that we seek to elbow our way into the workflow of attackers and try and disrupt the early phase reconnaissance and movement that can characterize the beginnings of a successful campaign. Now, in order to do that, I need to kind of go back to first principles a little bit. And what I'm going to try and do here is give you guys an attacker's eye view of reconnaissance assets on a network and how deception fits in with them. And so if you imagine from an attack perspective, an attacker coming in from the internet, like our guy at the top here, has a relatively small number of things he can do. He can perform remote exploits against assets in the DMZ, or if he's feeling flush, you know, he might have spent 100,000 euros on a zero-day attack. But it's incumbent on him to establish persistence inside the network, because otherwise, when these exploits are inevitably patched, he loses his investment. And so it's with this in mind that the modern attackers then realized that there were client-side vulnerabilities that were far more lucrative and far easier to compromise. Now, I'm going to start with good old-fashioned spear phishing email here, but I mean, you guys will have heard of the Tesla employee that was offered $1 million in Bitcoin to put a compromised USB into one of their servers. And I've got personal experience of speaking to a CISO who said that he was beginning to get his administrators threatened with physical harm. This was in South Africa, again on pain of putting compromised devices into servers. So what we have then is in this particular instance, let's stick with the slightly less sinister spear phishing email. Any attacker with any measure of resources behind him, I'm thinking about well-resourced nation states or criminal syndicates, they know that they can go to any social media site, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, find a person of interest, triangulate on the ones with the lower stringency social media settings, and then in 10 minutes you'll have the names of their kids, the names of their pets, their birthdays, the names of their spouses, and a lot of personal information about them. And if you send a precision crafted spear phishing email into a person like that with that information, our research and our estimates suggest you get a 1 in 6 click-through rate. So these are not foreign princes offering you long lost inheritances. These are precision crafted ones that reference friends, birthdays, personally identifiable information. And the click-through rate is alarmingly high. Now, once the attackers encouraged you to click on that link, there are a few things that will happen. Either you'll have advanced malware on your machine, you'll have a human attacker on your machine with the reverse shell out to command and control, or you'll be directed to a website, watering hole or drive-by, where either of those two eventualities can happen. So when the attacker is on your machine, his first question is what flavor of antivirus or EDR is protecting this machine? And if he doesn't like the one he finds there, he will just turn it off. And it's at that point that all of your other controls have failed. Firewall, IDS, IPS, AV, EDR, and email filtering. The attacker's next question is, how do I monetize this attack? What is my strategic goal, and what can I realistically gather from where I've landed? And the attacker will know that the machine he's landed on is a rich source of information about the surrounding network and about the principles at play in that network. So, for example, let's imagine our attacker has compromised Steve in HR. Steve is a relative low privilege user. He can't do anything on the network. He can't even install software on his machine. And so once the attacker has elevated privileges as Steve, injected into a system process and downloaded his attack tools, he can start looking in memory for credentials. And if he's fortunate, he's going to find a persona and an associated password that will move him forward in his attack. He might look for connections to other systems, in the RDP cache, in the SSH cache, in the browser cookies, the browser bookmarks, in the ARP cache. These are all sources of good information about the IP address convention and the naming convention on this network. He'll inevitably query Active Directory. This is hugely common now, and it's very difficult to protect. If an attacker, even as Steve from HR, wants to ask a question of AD about privileged users or about domain controllers, AD will tell him. AD doesn't care that he's not an admin. There's obviously man in the middle as well, so don't think Starbucks or any other form of coffee shop. Think about an attacker pretending to be a legitimate internal server and harvesting hashes and credentials from the users that believe him. Ransomware we've spoken about, and if you're in a position where your backups are in good shape, and you can afford to tell the attacker to get lost if they've encrypted something, then they're more likely now to say, well, we've taken some of your data offsite as well, and if you don't want it on the forums, you'll pay us anyway. And then finally, documents. Now, this is really the currency for the attacker, because within the information stored on the network, there is going to be something he can use. There will be business process details. There will be privileged user details. There might even be passwords or other information that he can monetize. Now, this list is already looking long, and it's already looking difficult to protect. And when you add in cloud, affairs stand a good chance of getting out of hand, because you're in a position now where you've got things like access keys that are going to give you access to the underlying API functions in the cloud and allow you to do all sorts of things. And you've got exposed storage buckets. If your data is exposed in a storage bucket in the cloud, in AWS or Azure, is it even really a hack? Because this is publicly accessible information. I don't subscribe to that point of view myself, but people do. And then ultimately, database and serverless functions. Now, all of these things are going to give the attacker a vision of a target system of interest from which he can derive some kind of value. Now, this is a long list of reconnaissance information. Any single one of them is difficult to protect. What we do at Attivo is we make sure it's all fake. And that way, an attacker interacting with this information or the target systems generates alerts for us rather than anything usable for him. Now, obviously, feel free to jump in and ask questions or put them in the chat, and I'm relying on Mark to keep an eye on the chat for me. But if that makes sense, then what I'll do is I'll go on to talk a bit about the architecture and how we make this happen. So, I mean, on the right-hand side here, really starting with this idea that your threats can be broadly attributed to three main classes. You know, if you've got contractors who are lax with the security settings or who are on the payroll of bad guys, then their ingress into your network needs to be looked at, needs to be treated seriously. Obviously, you have insider threats. You know, these are the people inside the environment that have decided that $1 million in Bitcoin sounds like a nice idea. Or who have got some kind of beef with the company. And then there's obviously the threat actors themselves. Now, obviously, we don't see so much of the hobbyist. I believe the phrase that used to be used when the Earth was still cooling was script kiddie. We don't see those anymore. These are all well-resourced, extensively funded criminal groups and nation states. So with that in mind, you know, given the scale of the problem, given the diversity of the adversaries you face, the architecture has to be quick to market and easy to deploy. So with the Attivo solution, we start with this notion of an appliance. Now, the appliance, you can have these in singles or multiples, and there is a management layer to allow you to command multiple appliances. But the idea is that these are physical, virtual, or cloud-based appliances. And so regardless of the choices you've made with your IT supply chain, you know, we don't care about the hypervisor. We don't care whether it's open source, whether it's cloud, or whether you'd prefer physical hardware. These things can interoperate, and you can have a fully heterogeneous environment using all of these technologies at once. But the idea is that they then contain deceptive content. Now, if you imagine an attacker on a network looking for systems to interact with, you know, the technical content, the technical currency he's going after will be the systems, will be the operating systems and the assets. And so what we have to do is to create deceptive versions of these that will blend in with the existing ones, will be a compelling target, and then we have to lead him to them. You know, back in the old days of what used to be called honeypotting, you would stick a vulnerable system in the corner of the network and hope an attacker would find it. The modern deception solutions have far more effectively adjusted to attacker workflows. And they know that attackers generally don't randomly scan networks these days, and that if something's placed in the corner for them to find, they will step around it. So what we do with this is by plugging an appliance equipped with these deceptive operating systems into the network, and into typically a trunk port on the network, which gives us visibility of multiple VLANs. I hope you guys can see my mouse. You have client networks, server networks, and specialized environments, all of which can be learned from. So by looking at broadcast and multicast traffic from these VLANs that are trunked to the appliance, we're in a position where we can learn about the assets on these networks. And they would typically be rather allowing us to identify the IP addresses, the names, the MAC addresses, and traffic characteristics of these devices. And with that information, we can automatically craft fake ones. So the black ones are real, and then we put the red ones down, which are fake. Now, these deceptive assets live on the appliance. So an attacker talking with one of these is effectively interacting back here, but we make it so that it can't be detected. And so these red assets then have the same footprint, the same, what I say, I mean, an identity footprint, the same traffic characteristics, the same DNS name format, the same IP address names, IP addresses, and these then form a high fidelity mesh of pressure sensors on the network. So any scans, probes, pokes, prods, sweeps, brute force attacks, attempts to compromise using exploit, broadcast-based attacks, these are the things that these assets will discover. So let's take a use case, for example, for a second. Let's say that you've got a CCTV network, and You know, you maybe your implementation partner has not been as diligent as you would like with hardening the passwords. So the attacker's gone to the internet, has identified the brand of CCTV camera you're running, and has typed in a default password and has installed software on it. And let's say he's equipping something like the Tori botnet. Now, Tori is not interested in making DDoS devices of your CCTV cameras. It wants to get into your production network. And if it does and starts to scan the network, this is the way we detect it. Because the slow, small, stealthy scans from an IoT network to enumerate assets and to start running exploits is exactly the kind of use case we protect against with this. But these things in red are also the ultimate destinations for attackers that land on the endpoints as well. And on the endpoints, we equip these credential cards. Now, these credentials on the endpoints, knowing as we do that the majority of these attacks are going to begin internally and probably on a workstation rather than a server, these credentials here are the things that you saw on the previous slide. So if an attacker lands on this machine and starts looking for reconnaissance information about the surrounding network, or assets to compromise, connections to other systems, credentials in memory, we give them to him. And as I said earlier, you know, by elbowing our way into the attacker's workflow, we're effectively feeding him fake information that sends him into the decoys as a reconnaissance trail rather than to production assets. So you can think of these pieces of content here, these reconnaissance clues, as a trail of breadcrumbs that leads the attacker into the decoys. And that then gives us this very, very useful detection surface that will allow us to feed really a fake reconnaissance trail into the attacker and give him the feeling that he's gathering information about his campaign and to support lateral movement, when the reality is he's giving clues as to where he is on the network and ultimately betraying his position by interacting with these decoys. But let's say, for example, that you get a super stealthy attacker, and an attacker who really understands the rhythms of a modern production network. And let's say that he doesn't want to look in memory for credentials because he doesn't, you know, he's maybe believes that the AV will find him, or he doesn't want to scan the network because he believes the IDS or IPS will find him. The remaining place where the attacker can go with relative impunity is Active Directory. And we're going to come onto this in a little bit more detail in a second, but Attivo can protect Active Directory from prying eyes without making any changes to production Active Directory. And this is a very important point, one of our key kind of areas of focus for this session. What it also, sorry, did somebody come off mute? I thought I heard someone speak.
Yes, I did. Sorry, Mick. We've just had a question in a little earlier, just to say, how do you exclude normal user behavior from the detection?
It's a great question. So, so typically we have processes by which we whitelist normal expected activity. This happens both from a decoy perspective with asset scanners and inventory scanners on the network, but it also happens from the perspective of endpoint detections as well, which I'll show in a little while. So typically a process of whitelisting and or excluding trusting assets, but also sometimes internal user activity you don't want to exclude. Direct your attention to the top right of this slide. Insider threat is a big use case for us. So it's also very useful if we can detect insider activity. Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Nick, one other question. Who are the owners and users of this solution? Is it networks or is it security?
So so typically the security teams, where you have a dedicated security function, will take this, but it's also a solution which can significantly support the capabilities of a network team who are having to stretch into the security function as well. So we've got examples of both types of customer. Typically the smaller customers, where there is not either a small or is there not a dedicated security function. This is owned and operated by networks and security interested networking people. But typically in the larger organizations where there is a dedicated function, it's owned by security. Thanks, Mark. So extending the reach of the deception. So what you're seeing here is a data center centric deployment model where the appliances are sent into trunk ports on the data center network. But what if you've got remote deployment requirements? What if there are remote branches? What if there are air gapped networks? What if there are environments where you can't reasonably supply a trunk port to an appliance? Well, Attivo has the solution by which you can borrow decoys from this central appliance here. So this central appliance is producing decoys for the trunked connections, but also using an Attivo equipped endpoint, we can send deception all the way across the network to these remote locations. Now, this is extraordinarily latency resilient as well. So for example, and I mean, looking at the audience, I'm not sure that this is probably quite a fanciful use case for most of the people here, but in military type environments where you are having to send decoys across satellite links to battlefield scenarios. I was once running this on a military engagement, and because of some routing misconfigurations, we were running this across a link that had a 2.5 second latency, and it functioned just fine. So inevitably, there are environments where it's difficult to gain network visibility, and those are often the use cases where you would want to deploy these kind of remote functions. Now, moving on to from a detection perspective, on one of Mark's slides, I'm sure you saw there is a blind spot between AV and EDR solutions from a Mitre detection perspective and between DLP solutions. In other words, these 4 classes of attack here are extremely difficult to detect. But this is an area that's well covered, admirably covered by Attivo. We have about 1,000 different alerts that come under these 4 categories. So what I'll do now is I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the attack types. I'm going to go over what might be considered a traditional deception attack path first, and then I'm going to go into the more exotic things like AD attacks and ransomware attacks. So starting really on this slide here, let's say that we've got a bad guy on one of the machines. He's encouraged somebody to click on a link, and he's established a point of presence on that workstation. In order to discover the network, he has to interact with content on the workstation. So by engaging these breadcrumbs and consuming these breadcrumbs, he's then directed to a position where a system can be perceived as being safe and can be chosen to interact with. So this is, the simplest form of deception workflow. An attacker lands on an endpoint, scrapes memory for some credential, password, or connection, follows that connection into the decoy, and raises a whole host of alerts while he's doing that. That's kind of a core use case. However, far more frequently now, we see, in addition to these types of behavior, we see Active Directory as the target and the destination. And the reason that we do that is because if we take Steve in finance again, Steve in HR, our previous user who was compromised, when Steve gets an attacker on his machine, the attacker knows that even as Steve, he can still ask questions of Active Directory. And everything the attacker could possibly want to know about privileged users, about where they're logged in, about delegations between assets, about domain controllers, he can gather from Steve's relatively low privileged account. So the attacker can ask Active Directory, give me a list of domain admins. And Active Directory with a clear conscience will give a list of domain admins. Ruth, John, Amy, Jim, and Michael are domain admins, and the attacker now knows about them. In the same way, the attacker can say, give me a list of domain controllers. And again, AD, with a happy heart, will return a list of domain controllers to the attacker. Now, this bad guy already knows more about your environment than you would ever want him to know. And he's done it without raising any alerts from your existing SOC tooling. So what Attivo realized with our existing endpoint capabilities, that we could add a function called AD Secure. AD Secure will allow all of these queries to run out, because there's a lot of legitimate LDAP traffic on the network. So this request for a list of privileged users could be being conducted by a trusted application. But if it's not, when Amy, John, Jim, Michael, and Ruth are returned to the attacker, we substitute the results and we give the attacker fake stuff. Now, from that perspective, obviously I've played these a little bit for laughs. These can be any name.surname credential. They just wouldn't be real domain admins. And in the same way, an attacker querying domain controllers gets a list of real domain controllers, but then that list is intercepted. So DC01020304 are replaced with deceptive ones, 1, 2, 3, and 4. These point the attacker straight into decoys. Now, the benefit is just the act of issuing these queries into Active Directory has raised alerts. And if the attacker then follows Ruth, John, Amy, Jim, or Michael into these assets, he raises a whole host more. So you've gone from a position where you had zero visibility of an attacker performing reconnaissance against your network using AD calls to being in a position where you get a whole host of alerts when they do, and you can send them up the wrong path to buy you more time and to reinforce your response position ahead of any real damage being done. So that's the AD piece. Now, as I say, this is very much a kind of incremental functionality on traditional deception use cases, but it's become something that we very, very strongly rely on, particularly with good quality red teams, nation states, criminal syndicates, because they are all using command line tools. If you think about some of these things, Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire, all these kinds of things, they are effectively endpoint centric in their access and in the way that they operate. And so visibility of both the command line and specifically the LDAP queries being generated from the command line is a really valuable adjunct to the existing detections. So let me move on now to a thing called Data Cloak, which is a ransomware protection capability. Again, using the Attivo endpoint. Now, I'm sure you guys will have heard all of the the pitches for antivirus solutions in terms of how they detect ransomware, and you'll probably have heard talk of hashes, heuristics, behavior analyses, those kinds of things, reputations. What Attivo have done is contributed to the defense in depth onion with a solution that we think addresses ransomware in an entirely different way to anything else. And in the first instance, that we must ask ourselves really whether it's exfiltration-based ransomware that's going to steal your data and blackmail you to keep it secret, or whether it's encryption-based ransomware, which is going to encrypt data and not return functionality to you unless you pay, or destructware, vandalismware, where they just break systems. In all instances, the common currency for those classes of ransomware is data. Documents, PowerPoints, documents, spreadsheets, Word documents, zip files, system files. And so from that perspective, all of the assets that you see on the screen, the network connected workstation here, the file server, the web-based storage, the cloud storage, and the removable media are all hosts of this kind of information. So at a command line level, without interrupting the normal workflows of the GUI connected users, at a machine level, we hide that data. And at the same time, we hide the network connections into those remote assets, the file servers, the cloud storage, and the removable storage. And what this means is when we get an attacker on that machine deploying cryptographic or exfiltration-based ransomware, there's nothing for it to find. It can see nothing of any interest. And what we then do is we surface to it a deceptive network share that's populated with self-replicating data. And in this instance, when the malware finds its way into that archive, we keep throwing it Attivo created worthless data that keeps replicating itself, keeping the ransomware busy and giving you incident response time to mobilize and allowing us to send an automatic quarantine into the endpoint and remove it from the network. So we've got a position here really where if all of your other defenses fail against ransomware, and let's face it, they do, otherwise we wouldn't be hearing about it in the news, this is your get out of jail free card. Because by diverting ransomware into safe deceptive shares with this self-replicating data that has no consequence if it's encrypted, you're in a position where you can buy yourself time and get the attackers off the network from a patient zero perspective before they become problematic. So I'm just going to power through the last couple of slides. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. Really, the deception platform that you see on the screen here, we call this the Pancake slide, restates the point, and that is from a flexibility perspective, starting at the bottom, regardless of what you've chosen for your IT systems, for your supply chain, the virtualization-based solutions, the cloud hypervisors, cloud workloads, open source or physical appliances, we've got a solution that will sit comfortably on all of these and interoperate with the ones that may sit on other surfaces. From a deceptive operating system, we support all of the ones you would expect. If you don't see yours here, don't worry. If it can be virtualized, we can probably use it. And then similarly, you then populate this content with interesting data From an industrial controls perspective, I don't think there's anybody here that's interested in that, but there's lots we can do to protect against those kind of big iron industrial systems. I've got some great anecdotes about medical devices, detection of medical devices in production, if anyone wants to hear. And then finally at the top here, the deceptive credentials, the lures, the breadcrumbs that we put on the user machines that lead the attackers into the decoys. Now, all of those things in combination ultimately put down a highly convincing mesh of fake assets that no legitimate system or user should ever interact with. And if they do interact with it, it's probably bad. And in that instance, once you've whitelisted the asset scanners, the inventory scanners, and everything else, you're left with a system that is quiet in peacetime. But when you do get alerts, you then want to be able to mobilize those alerts to support workflows that you probably already have. And that's where the integration list here comes in. So, for example, if you want to use a firewall to restrict access by a problematic endpoint to command and control, or take it off the network, segregate it, and your firewalls are thus configured, you can do this. We've got a whole array of different SIM solutions, all of the syslog compliance SIM solutions we talk to, and some very interesting additional integrations with the big four, QRadar, Logarithm, ArcSight, and Splunk. And then similarly, threat intelligence, threat enrichment to supply reputational information about URLs, about IP addresses, DNS names, or file-based malware. Quarantine opportunities with endpoint-based solutions. Monitoring of cloud productivity applications for deceptive logins. Automatic ticketing. Automatic distribution of the Attivo content and the endpoints, as well as integration into the usual suspects from a orchestration perspective, and an API that we can then use to craft responses that we may not currently support that would inject into your existing workflows. So that was everything I wanted to cover today. I think from the perspective of a deception solution, the sorts of things I really wanted to shout out as highlights were speed and ease of deployment, flexibility of deployment on a disparate architecture, but then also into some of the real innovations, some of the differences that you may not have expected to see, things like Active Directory protection without changing Active Directory, and things like ransomware protection using obfuscation and deception rather than trying to detect the malware at work. And then the final point here, inevitably, we will have strong integrations with something in your environment. And that will support then whatever workflows and incident response you want to subject the machine to that has been caught by this solution. So I think that gives us a few minutes for questions and any kind of further steps. Were there any more questions?
I think there's one come up, Nick. So somebody's asked, what does incident response with Attivo look like? And I kind of guess you've covered that in briefly, but can you give us any more detail around that?
Yes, of course. Yeah, and I think this slide speaks to it very, very strongly. So, I mean, for an organization that doesn't currently have an incident response, there's the presence of a solution like this and some of the automations that exist within Attivo, independent of anything you see on screen, does give a measure of incident response even to organizations that haven't considered that before. If your default response to a compromised endpoint on the network is just to take it off the network and re-image it, then that is a perfectly valid response, and it's something that we can support using quarantine, getting the machine away from potential trouble spots and getting it ready for re-imaging. But there are other things that we can do. For example, forensics captures, to give you a view of anything that your AV might have missed and any problematic processes on an endpoint that you might be able to then feed back to other security stakeholders that you have in your organization. Or similarly, the more exotic stuff here, for example, where you might provide a chained response to a problematic endpoint, where you would perform a forensics capture, you would perform a memory dump, you would get the machine off the network, and then you would forward those forensics artifacts into the rest of the process, send them up to L2 or L3 for analysis, and then update the ticket and distribute a progress report. So the incident response processes, by virtue not only of the integrations here, but also native automation within the product, are actually pretty rich.
Just one more question here, Nick. How long does it take to deploy?
So typically, I mean, there are a number of different flavors for deployment within Attivo. So, you know, you have the ability, for example, to get something to market extremely quickly. You know, I mean, and I'm not being glib when I say that you can get a measure of base level deception down in a couple of hours. If you want to do a more kind of full featured deception, including network decoys, including fully interactive operating systems, deceptive content integrated with the existing production infrastructure, can take a little longer. But for a large corporate, we typically say 10 to 15 days for a full install. Or it can be for, you know, for a base level kind of crawl, walk, run beginner install. It can be just a couple of hours, half a day.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please join us on our next webinar, which will be with Fortinet tomorrow at 4 p.m. I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Have a good day.
Bye.